Beneath the streets we walk, in the shadows we ignore, something watches, waits, and whispers our names. Tonight, I'll take you deep into the darkness, true events twisted into horror, where reality blurs with nightmares. 5 chilling stories, each more terrifying than the last. So turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and listen closely. Because some things, they don't just stay in the dark, they follow you home. Story 1. The Man Watching from the Window. When Sarah and I moved into our new home, we felt like we had finally made it. After years of saving, searching, and dreaming, we had found the perfect house, a cozy 2-story home in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. It had everything we wanted: a spacious backyard for summer barbecues, a bright kitchen with bay windows, and a living room with floor-to-ceiling glass panels that let in the golden evening light. It felt warm, safe, and full of promise. Our first night in the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel a little uneasy when you're used to the noise of apartment living. No footsteps above us, no muffled voices through thin walls, just silence. We spent the evening unpacking, arranging furniture, and talking about how this was where we would build our future. By the time we finally settled onto the couch with a couple of beers, it was nearly midnight. That's when Sarah saw him. She froze mid-sip, her eyes locked on something outside. I followed her gaze to the large living room window, and for a split second, I saw it too. A figure, standing just beyond the glass, motionless. "Mark." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding. But when I turned on the porch light, the man was gone. Just the empty yard and the darkened street beyond it. "Probably just a neighbor," I said, forcing a chuckle. "Taking a late-night walk." Sarah didn't look convinced. He wasn't walking. He was just watching. I didn't have an answer for that. We checked the locks, closed the blinds, and tried to brush it off. But as we headed upstairs to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was hadn't really left. At first, I didn't think much of that night. I reassured Sarah, locked the doors, and went to sleep without a second thought. But for Sarah, it didn't end there. A few nights later, she woke me up in the middle of the night, her fingers gripping my arm. "He's out there again," she whispered. Still half asleep, I groggily followed her downstairs. She pointed toward the living room window, but when I peeked through the blinds, there was nothing. The yard was empty, the street silent. "Are you sure?" I asked. She nodded, eyes wide. He was just there, standing in the same spot. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, scanning the area. No footprints in the damp grass. No sound of retreating footsteps. Nothing. The next morning, Sarah told me she had seen him 3 times since the first night. Always standing outside, always watching. But somehow, he would vanish before I could see him. "Maybe it's just the stress of the move," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "Your mind could be playing tricks on you." She didn't argue, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. We asked the neighbors if they had seen anyone unusual hanging around. Most of them gave us polite but puzzled looks. This was a quiet, safe neighborhood. People didn't just loiter outside strangers' homes. As the days passed, Sarah's unease grew. Every evening, she closed all the curtains before the sun even set. She started avoiding the living room altogether after dark, saying she felt watched even with the blinds drawn. Eventually, I gave in and bought a security camera. If someone was really out there, this would catch them. The first night after we installed it, Sarah finally seemed to relax a little. "If he's real, we'll have proof," she said. I agreed, but deep down, I was still convinced we wouldn't see anything at all. I was wrong. Sarah was the first to check the footage. The next morning, while I was making coffee, I heard her gasp from the couch. She was hunched over her laptop, eyes glued to the screen. "Mark, you need to see this." I set my mug down and walked over. The video was from the previous night, just after 3 a.m. At first, nothing seemed unusual, just our front yard, empty and still. But then, from the shadows at the edge of the street, a figure emerged. The man. He walked up to our house and stopped at the same spot outside the living room window. He didn't move. He didn't shift his weight or turn his head. He just stood there, staring. I glanced at the timestamp. 3:01 a.m. Sarah fast-forwarded the footage. The time changed. 3:15 a.m. 3:45 a.m. 4:10 a.m. The man didn't budge. He stood there for over an hour, Sarah whispered. A chill ran through me. This wasn't some drunk wanderer or a lost neighbor. This was deliberate. Then she clicked on the next video. It was from the night before. Same time, same spot, same unmoving figure. She played another, and another. The pattern repeated every single night. I swallowed hard. Pause it, I said. Go to last night's clip. Sarah hesitated, then scrolled to the latest recording. The video played. At 3:33 a.m., something changed. For the first time in any of the recordings, the man moved. Slowly, unnervingly, he turned his head, not toward the window, but directly at the camera. And then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't even a grin of amusement. It was cold, knowing, deliberate. A slow curl of the lips, as if he had been waiting for us to see him. Then, without breaking eye contact, he stepped backward into the darkness and disappeared. Sarah slammed the laptop shut. We're calling the police. The officers arrived within the hour. We explained everything, the sightings, the footage, the feeling of being watched. They took it seriously, at least at first. They searched the yard. No footprints, no disturbed grass, no signs of forced entry. If he was standing there that long, wouldn't there be something? Sarah asked. One of the officers shrugged. If he's light on his feet, maybe not. Could just be a vagrant passing through. I played them the recording of the man staring at the camera. The officer watching furrowed his brow. Creepy, he admitted, but not illegal. Another officer promised to increase patrols in the area, but his voice lacked conviction. I could tell what they were thinking. A drifter, a harmless trespasser, nothing to worry about. But Sarah and I knew better, because that man wasn't just passing through. He was waiting for something. The note appeared 3 days after we called the police. It was a cold, overcast evening. I had just gotten home from work when Sarah met me at the door, her face pale. She didn't say anything, just handed me a crumpled piece of paper. I unfolded it and felt a chill creep down my spine. Why do you close the curtains? I can still see you. The handwriting was erratic, almost childlike, with uneven letters that slanted in different directions. Some words were smudged, as if written in a rush. Where did you find this? I asked. On the porch, she whispered. It was just sitting there. No envelope. Nothing. I immediately checked the security footage, but for the first time, the camera had failed. The recording cut off just after 2 a.m., leaving a gap until sunrise. The man had been here. He had left this note, and he knew we were watching him. That Friday, I had to work late. I didn't want to leave Sarah alone, but she insisted she'd be fine. We had a security system now, a deadbolt on every door, and patrols passing through the neighborhood. At around 11:30 p.m., I was finishing up at the office when my phone vibrated. Incoming call, Sarah. I answered immediately. Hey, everything okay? There was no response, just breathing. Shaky, panicked breathing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Sarah said, "Someone's in the house." I shot up from my chair. What? Where are you? In the closet, she whimpered. I heard the floor creak. I thought it was outside at first, but then I heard footsteps inside. Mark, he's in the house. My blood ran cold. Stay quiet. I'm calling 911. I switched lines, my fingers shaking as I dialed. The dispatcher assured me officers were on the way, but every second felt like an eternity. Sarah didn't hang up. I could hear her breathing, ragged and shallow. Then, slow, deliberate, getting closer. I clenched my jaw. Sarah, don't move. Don't make a sound. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then, in the distance over the phone, I heard the sound of the front door bursting open. The police. A voice shouted, "Sheriff's Department." Then the sound of heavy boots storming inside. Sarah? I called. She let out a gasping sob. I'm here. I exhaled in relief, but it was short-lived, because when the police searched the house, they found the back door wide open. No signs of forced entry. No broken locks. No shattered glass. Whoever had been inside had come in willingly. I raced home. The police searched every inch of the house but found nothing. No intruder. No signs of where he had gone. Then we checked the security footage. The recording started at 10:57 p.m. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The living room was dark, the curtains drawn. Then, at 11:12 p.m., a shadow moved in the hallway. Inside the house, Sarah and I watched in horror as the man stepped into view. He was tall, gaunt, his clothes hanging loosely on his frame. He didn't move like a typical intruder. He didn't rifle through drawers or look for valuables. He just stood there, in the hallway, facing our bedroom door, watching. For almost an hour, he didn't move, just stood in the dim light, completely still. Then, at 12:03 a.m., he turned, slowly, deliberately, and walked toward the security camera in the living room. He leaned in close. His mouth moved, whispering something. Then the screen went black. We rewound the footage, turned the volume up as high as it would go. But the whisper was nothing but static and distortion. We couldn't understand what he said. We weren't sure we wanted to. Sarah was at her breaking point. After weeks of feeling hunted, of seeing him, knowing he was there, and never having proof solid enough for the police to take action, she refused to live in fear any longer. "We stay up tonight," she said firmly. "No sleeping. No waiting for him to show up on a camera. If he comes, we see him with our own eyes." I agreed. I had to. This had gone far beyond paranoia. Someone had been in our house. Someone had been watching us for weeks. So that night, we sat in the darkened living room, side by side on the couch. The security monitor was on, displaying a live feed of the front yard. I gripped a baseball bat in my hands, my knuckles tight around the handle. We waited. 2:30 a.m. 3 a.m. 3:30 a.m. Sarah glanced at the clock, her breath hitching. "He always comes at 3:33. I stared at the screen. Nothing. 3:32 a.m. Still nothing. Then, for the first time in weeks, he didn't appear. Sarah let out a shaky breath. Maybe he's finally gone. That's when we heard it. A slow, deliberate creak from upstairs. Footsteps. Inside the house. Sarah gasped, slapping a hand over her mouth. My grip on the bat tightened. We listened, barely breathing. The footsteps weren't hurried. They were measured, careful, almost as if whoever was up there wanted us to hear. Then another sound. A soft thump. It was coming from the hallway ceiling. The attic. I motioned for Sarah to call the police. She fumbled for her phone as I rose to my feet, heart pounding. I had never even been up in the attic. We didn't use it, hadn't stored anything up there. But now, the hatch in the ceiling was slightly ajar. Something was up there. Or someone. Holding my breath, I reached up and slowly pushed the attic door fully open. A musty smell drifted down, thick and stale. I grabbed a flashlight from the shelf and hoisted myself up. The attic was small, the air stifling. Dust particles floated in the beam of my flashlight as I scanned the space. At first, it looked empty. Then my light landed on the far corner, and my stomach dropped. A makeshift sleeping area, old blankets, food wrappers, empty water bottles, and worse, dozens of photographs. I stepped closer, my hands trembling as I lifted one. It was Sarah, sleeping. Another, Sarah brushing her hair in the bathroom. Another, Sarah reading in bed, all taken from inside the house. I turned, bile rising in my throat. He had been living here, watching us, the entire time. Then I heard it, the rush of movement behind me. Before I could react, something dropped down from the attic hatch. Sarah screamed. I lunged for the opening and caught a glimpse of him, tall, gaunt. His face stretched into an unnatural grin as he bolted toward the back door. Adrenaline surged through me. I leapt down, nearly twisting my ankle as I chased after him. I reached the back door just as it slammed open. The man was fast, too fast. He sprinted across the yard and into the woods behind our house, disappearing into the darkness. Moments later, sirens blared as the police arrived. They searched the area. They combed the woods. But they never found him. Not that night. Not ever. The police took our statements. They found the attic exactly as I described, a hidden space where someone had been living for who knows how long. They took the photos as evidence, but without a suspect, there wasn't much they could do. Sarah and I left that house within the week. We didn't sell it. We didn't even pack properly. We just left, because even though we never saw him again, I still have nightmares. About 3:33 a.m. About the attic. About the man watching from the window. And worst of all, about the whisper on the security footage. Because after the police enhanced the audio, they finally understood what he said before the camera went black. I've been inside the whole time. The police investigation stretched on for weeks, but in the end, they had more questions than answers. The photos they found in the attic were the most chilling part. They weren't just of Sarah sleeping in our bed. They included images taken long before we even moved in. Some were dated nearly a year earlier. Others showed the house when it was empty, as if he had been watching the property long before we became its owners. That meant one thing. He had always been there. The man's identity remained a mystery. No fingerprints, no DNA, no records matching his description. He was a ghost. Sarah and I didn't wait for answers. We put the house up for sale immediately. We didn't care about losing money, about breaking contracts. We just needed to get out. The day before we left, Sarah did one final walkthrough. I stayed outside, packing the car, when she called for me. Her voice was shaking. I rushed inside to find her standing beneath the attic hatch, staring up. "I just wanted to check one last time," she murmured. She climbed up carefully, sweeping her flashlight across the now empty space. The old blankets, the food wrappers, the horrifying photographs, all had been taken as evidence. The attic should have been empty, but there, in the farthest corner, sat a small, folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, Sarah picked it up and opened it. Inside, written in the same erratic, childlike handwriting as before, was a single sentence: "I'll find you again." Sarah dropped the note as if it had burned her. We left that night. We never looked back. Months passed. We settled into a new home in another state. We told ourselves we were safe now, that it was over. Then, one morning, Sarah went to check the mail. She came back inside pale as a ghost, holding a single envelope with no return address. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single photograph of Sarah, sleeping, in our new home. Story 2. The Closet. When I first moved into my apartment in Denver, I was excited to finally have a place of my own. It was a small but charming one-bedroom unit in an older building, perfect for starting my new life after college. The rent was affordable, and the location was great, just a short walk from my new job. The apartment had character. Hardwood floors that creaked in places, slightly outdated fixtures, and a built-in closet in the bedroom that stretched almost the entire length of one wall. It was deeper than most closets, with heavy wooden doors that groaned whenever I opened them. At first, everything seemed normal. I spent my days working and my evenings settling in, unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, trying to make the space feel like home. But after the first week, little things started to feel off. I'd set my keys on the counter, only to find them later on the coffee table. A kitchen cabinet I swore I had closed would be slightly open when I walked by. More than once, I'd wake up in the morning to find my bedroom door cracked open, even though I always shut it before going to bed. I told myself I was just adjusting to a new routine, that I was tired and forgetful. Maybe I had left the door open and just didn't remember. Maybe I was absent-mindedly moving things without thinking. It wasn't a big deal. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. The small, odd occurrences didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. I'd open my closet to grab a sweater and notice my clothes weren't hanging quite right, as if someone had brushed against them. Some shirts would be bunched together, others slightly askew. I told myself it was just me. Maybe I had pulled something out in a hurry and not noticed. But then there was the smell. No matter how much I cleaned, a faint but undeniable stench lingered in my bedroom. It was subtle at first, something musky, like old sweat. But some nights, it took on a sharper edge, something almost rotten, like food left out too long. I scrubbed the floors, washed my sheets twice a week, even placed air fresheners around the room. Nothing made a difference. Then, one morning, I opened my fridge and noticed something was missing. A container of leftover pasta I had planned to take for lunch was gone. At first, I thought I had eaten it and forgotten. But then I noticed other small things. Half a loaf of bread missing when I was sure I hadn't touched it. An empty cereal box I didn't remember finishing. I started to feel uneasy in my own home, but I kept pushing the thoughts away. Maybe I was just being careless. Maybe I had eaten more than I thought. Then came the night that changed everything. I was lying in bed, scrolling mindlessly on my phone, when I heard it. Soft, steady breathing. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe through the vent or the thin walls. But the more I listened, the more certain I became it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside my room, from the closet. I went completely still, barely even breathing myself. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever, whatever, was in there would hear it. I wanted to turn on the light. I wanted to get up and run, but I couldn't move. I lay there, frozen, listening to the slow, quiet inhale and exhale of something just a few feet away. Minutes passed. I don't know how many. Eventually, the sound stopped. I kept my eyes open until exhaustion finally pulled me into a restless sleep. The next morning, as soon as the sun was up, I forced myself to open the closet. Everything looked normal. My clothes hung neatly. My shoes lined up just as I had left them. But when I looked down, my stomach dropped. There was a faint imprint on the wooden floor. A smudge, almost like the outline of someone sitting there, legs bent, right in the middle of my closet. That was the moment I knew something was wrong. That afternoon, I told my best friend Lisa about it over coffee. She laughed at first, joking that maybe I had a ghost. Or, she said with a smirk, maybe you have a secret roommate. I tried to laugh with her, but the fear sat heavy in my chest. Lisa offered to stay the night, and I eagerly agreed. Having someone else there made me feel safer, even a little foolish. We watched movies, ordered takeout, and by the time we went to bed, I almost convinced myself that I had overreacted. Nothing happened that night. No noises, no breathing, no strange smells. The next morning, Lisa teased me. "See, it's all in your head," she said as she grabbed her coat. But that night, after she left, the noises started again. And this time, they were clearer. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was happening in my apartment, and I needed proof. Determined to figure out what was going on, I bought a small security camera, just a cheap one that I could set up on my nightstand, facing my bedroom. If nothing happened, then fine. But if I wasn't imagining things, I needed to know. That night, I went to bed as usual, locking my bedroom door like I had started doing every night. The air still carried that faint, awful smell, but I tried to ignore it. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy, like I had been watched. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone to check the footage. At first, nothing. Hours of me just sleeping, shifting occasionally under the blankets. Then, around 2 a.m., movement. The closet door, which had been shut, slowly creaked open. A figure emerged. A man. He moved cautiously, stepping out into my room, his posture low, almost crawling. He was thin, wearing clothes that looked old and filthy. His hair was greasy, hanging over his face. And then, he just stood there, watching me, for over an hour. The footage showed him standing by the foot of my bed, tilting his head slightly, as if studying me. At one point, he moved closer. My sleeping face was just inches from his. Then, as quietly as he had come, he crept back to the closet. The door shut behind him. I nearly dropped my phone. My body went cold, my fingers trembling as I replayed the footage, hoping, praying, I was seeing it wrong. But it was real. I wasn't alone. I scrambled out of bed and locked myself in the bathroom, my breath coming in short gasps as I dialed 911. The operator tried to keep me calm, but I could barely speak. There's someone in my apartment. He was watching me. Within minutes, the police arrived. I barely managed to unlock the front door before retreating back into the bathroom. I could hear them moving through the apartment, checking every room. Then, one of them called out, "The closet's empty." No, that couldn't be. He was there. I had seen him. One of the officers stepped inside the closet, running his hand along the back wall. He paused, knocked once, a hollow sound. Then, carefully, he pressed against the paneling. It shifted. The police pulled at the wood, revealing a narrow, hidden crawl space just behind the closet wall. And inside, a nest of dirty blankets, empty food wrappers, and something that made my stomach turn. Photos of me. Some were taken outside, normal enough. But others were from inside my apartment. My kitchen, my bathroom, my bedroom. One, taken from the closet, showed me asleep in bed. I don't remember much after that. Just the sound of my own breathing, the way my skin prickled with dread. The police searched the entire building, but didn't find him. He was gone, but he had been there, living in my apartment, watching me. For how long? I'll never know. The police stayed in my apartment for hours, combing through every inch of the hidden crawl space, dusting for fingerprints, collecting the horrifying evidence he had left behind. I sat on my couch, wrapped in a blanket, numb. One of the officers sat down across from me. "It looks like he's been here for a while," he said gently. "Weeks, maybe even months." I stared at him. Months. My voice was barely a whisper. They explained that the man had likely been slipping out when I was at work, eating my food, moving my things, watching me. The closet had been his hiding spot, his home. Every night, while I slept just feet away, he had been there. He was careful, another officer added. There are no signs of forced entry, which means he either had access to a key or he hesitated. Or he got in when the previous tenant was still here and never left. I felt sick. I had been living with him, sleeping with him just on the other side of that thin wooden panel. They took his fingerprints, but when the results came back, there were no matches in any criminal database. No records, no name, nothing. It was like he didn't exist, but I had seen him before. The memory surfaced slowly, like something I had buried deep without realizing it. A few months ago, just before moving in, I had stopped at a grocery store near my apartment. As I was walking out, I saw a homeless man sitting near the entrance. He looked rough, thin, dirty, eyes sunken, but he wasn't aggressive like some of the others I'd encountered. When he asked for change, I gave him the few dollars I had in my pocket. It was just a small, passing moment, one I barely thought about afterward. But now, as I sat in my apartment, my mind raced with possibilities. Had it been him? Had he followed me home that day? Watched me? Learned my routine? Had this been his plan all along? I'll never know for sure. The only thing I know is that he was here, living in my closet, watching me sleep, and he might still be out there. I didn't spend another night in that apartment. Within hours of the police finishing their search, I packed a bag and left, staying with Lisa until I could break my lease. I didn't care about losing my deposit. I didn't care about anything except getting away. I barely slept those first few nights. Every sound, every shadow sent me into a panic. I kept my closet doors open, checked every corner before going to bed, and triple-locked my new apartment door. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. A few weeks later, I got a call from the detective handling my case. "We never found him." I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" "He escaped through the ventilation system in your building. We searched every exit, checked security cameras, but," he sighed, "it's like he vanished." My hands felt ice cold as I gripped my phone. "Just be careful," he added. "If anything seems off, call us immediately." I hung up and sat there, staring at the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself he was gone. He had no reason to come after me. It was over. And for a while, I almost believed it. Until the package arrived. It was a small, unmarked box left on my doorstep one evening. No return address. No postage stamp. Just my name. My fingers shook as I opened it. Inside, there was only one thing. A single photograph. Of me. Asleep in my new bedroom. The walls were unmistakable. The bed, the blanket, even the shirt I had worn to bed the night before. The picture had been taken from inside my apartment. I dropped the box and stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps. I turned, scanning the room, my pulse hammering in my ears. The locks were still in place. The windows were shut. There was no sign of forced entry. But somehow, he had been here, and he had found me. Story 3. The Man Under the Sewer. I work for the city of Los Angeles as part of a maintenance crew. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays the bills. Most days, it's just fixing leaks, clearing blockages, and making sure the underground sewage tunnels don't collapse under the weight of the city above. You'd be surprised how much goes on beneath the streets. Miles and miles of tunnels, some dating back nearly a century. A few weeks ago, we got a call about something unusual. Residents near an older part of town had been complaining about a terrible smell coming up from the drains. Not the usual stink of sewage, but something worse. Some even claimed to have heard noises at night. Muffled voices coming from the storm grates. Whispers floating up from the darkness. We didn't think much of it. Probably just a broken pipe or rats. Lots of rats down there. Our supervisor sent a team of 4 to check it out. Me, Jake, Luis, and our new guy, Brandon. It was already getting late when we climbed down into the tunnels, flashlights cutting through the thick, stagnant air. The deeper we went, the worse the smell got, like something rotting, mixed with the damp, moldy stench of old water. We moved slowly, checking for cracks, looking for anything unusual. The tunnels stretched endlessly, winding and twisting like a labyrinth beneath the city. The sound of dripping water echoed around us. Every now and then, something skittered past, probably just rats, though we never saw them. Then Jake stopped. "Did you hear that?" he asked. We all went silent, listening. At first, there was nothing but the usual sounds, the distant rush of water, the occasional drip. But then, faintly, there it was. A whisper. It didn't make sense. It wasn't the sound of water or rats. It was words, too soft to understand, but unmistakably human. Brandon laughed nervously. "It's probably just an echo," he said. "Or maybe the pipes carrying sound from above." Jake didn't look convinced. He shone his flashlight down the tunnel ahead, but there was nothing there. Just more darkness. "Come on," Luis said. "Let's just get this over with." We pressed forward, but that strange feeling, that something was down there with us, never quite left. The complaints didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. A woman living near the storm drain swore she saw someone staring up at her from below, their face barely visible through the metal grates. When she called out, they vanished. Another man, homeless, living near an underpass, claimed he'd seen something crawling in the tunnels one night. He shouted at it, thinking it was another transient, but then it stopped. And in the darkness, he heard it whisper his name. He ran and never went back. The strangest report came from a teenager. He had been messing around with his friends when his phone slipped out of his hands and fell into a storm drain. When he knelt down and shined his flashlight inside, he saw a pair of glowing, pale eyes staring back. He didn't try to get his phone after that. By then, it was clear we had to go back. If someone was living down there, we needed to know. The city couldn't have people sneaking into the tunnels, especially if they were dangerous. Jake, Luis, Brandon, and I returned the next night, this time with better gear, stronger flashlights, a camera, and a walkie-talkie system to stay in contact. As we descended into the tunnels again, the stench was still there, thick and sour, but there was something else now, a kind of stillness, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. It didn't take long to find something new. On the walls, carved into the grime and concrete, were strange markings. At first, we thought it was graffiti, but as we got closer, I saw that they weren't drawn with paint or ink. They were scratches. Long, deep scratches, as if someone had been dragging their fingernails over the walls for years. Then the whispering started again. Only this time, it was closer. We froze. It was coming from somewhere ahead of us, just around a bend in the tunnel. It wasn't one voice, but several, layered on top of each other, overlapping, like an eerie chorus. Brandon turned on the camera and stepped forward cautiously. His flashlight swept over the floor, the walls, the endless dark ahead. Then he stopped. "Guys, over here," he said, his voice tight. We hurried over and saw what he was looking at. A pile of bones. Not small animal bones. Bigger ones. Some broken, some picked clean. Human bones. And next to them, there was something else. A crude nest, made of tattered clothing, old blankets, and plastic scraps. It looked lived in. At the center of it all was something that shouldn't have been there. A photograph. Jake picked it up, wiping the dirt away. His face changed, his grip tightening. It was an old, faded picture of a child. Jake's younger self. Jake's hands trembled as he stared at the photograph. His mouth opened like he wanted to say something, but no words came out. None of us knew what to say. How the hell did a picture of Jake as a kid end up in a sewer nest? "We need to go," Jake finally muttered, his voice tight. "Now." "Wait," Tom said. He was one of the senior workers, called in for this second inspection. He hadn't been with us the first time. "We came all this way. What if someone's down here? We need to check." "No," Jake snapped. "We're done. Something's..." A scream cut him off. Tom's scream. It came from around the bend ahead. It was sharp, panicked, then cut off completely, like someone had yanked him away mid-breath. We bolted forward, flashlights swinging wildly. When we turned the corner, all we found was Tom's flashlight lying on the ground, flickering weakly. The tunnel stretched ahead, empty. No sign of him. "Tom," Luis called out. His voice echoed, bouncing off the walls. No answer. Then we heard it. The whispering. It was different now, not distant, not faint. It was close, right around us. And then it laughed. Not a deep, human laugh. Something soft, mocking, like it was playing with us. My chest tightened, my grip on the flashlight slick with sweat. A shadow moved ahead. At first, it was just a shape, barely visible in the dim tunnel. Then it stepped forward. A figure, tall, impossibly thin, its pale skin stretched tight over its bones. Its limbs were long, almost too long, fingers curled like claws. And its eyes, faintly glowing in the dark, locked onto us with something between curiosity and hunger. Then it spoke. "Help me," Tom's voice. But it wasn't Tom. The sound came from its mouth, but the lips didn't move right, like they weren't made for speech. The tone was perfect, the exact way Tom had sounded before he screamed. Then it grinned. We ran. None of us needed to yell it. We all just turned and sprinted, boots slamming against the wet concrete. Behind us, we heard it move. Not footsteps. Something worse. A rapid, scraping skitter, like it was running on all fours. I didn't look back. None of us did. We tore through the tunnels, gasping for breath, the exit ladder finally in sight. Luis got there first, practically throwing himself up the rungs. Brandon followed. Jake was next. I was right behind him when he suddenly stopped. I turned, and there it was, standing just at the edge of our flashlight beams, head tilted, watching us. It didn't chase anymore. It didn't need to. It smiled, wide and unnatural. And then, in the quiet, it whispered, "Jake, welcome back." The words barely left its lips before it melted into the darkness. Jake was the last one up the ladder, slamming the manhole cover shut behind us. We never went back down, and Tom was never found. The police searched the tunnels for days. They brought in cadaver dogs, forensic teams, even thermal imaging cameras. But they found nothing. No signs of Tom. No footprints. No drag marks. It was as if he had never been there at all. What they did find were the bones. Not just one set, but dozens. Some old, brittle with time. Others more recent. When they ran the remains through their database, the results were chilling. Missing persons dating back decades. People who had disappeared without a trace, some as far back as the 1960s. No pattern, no clear link between them, except that none of them had ever been seen again. Jake didn't talk much after that. He quit his job with the city and tried to move on, but I could tell something was eating at him. A few weeks later, I found out why. One night, he called me. His voice was shaky. "I found something," he said, "about my family." I met him at a bar, where he laid out what he had learned. Years ago, long before he was born, his uncle had gone missing. He was just a boy, maybe 8 or 9. One day, he was playing near a construction site where they were working on the city's sewer system, and then he was gone. No one ever found him. No body. Nothing. His family never talked about it much. Then Jake showed me a picture. It was old, black and white, but I could see the resemblance. His uncle as a child. And when I compared it to the photograph we found in the sewer, it was the same one. "That thing," Jake said, his fingers tightening around the glass in his hand. Do you think it was him?" I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to say anything at all. Weeks passed. We tried to move on, tried to forget. Then, one night, Jake called me again. This time, he was whispering, "It's back." I felt my stomach drop. He told me he'd been hearing things at night. Scratching. At first, he thought it was rats in the walls, but then he heard it under the floorboards. A slow, deliberate scraping, like nails dragging across wood. And then, the night before, he finally worked up the nerve to check the storm drain outside his apartment. At first, it was empty, just a black hole leading into the depths below. Then he saw them, 2 pale, glowing eyes staring up at him. And in the silence, just before he stumbled back, he heard it whisper, soft, familiar, wrong. "You belong here, Jake. Come home." That was the last time I ever spoke to him. The next morning, his apartment was empty. The door locked from the inside. His phone left behind on the counter. Jake was gone, and I knew exactly where he had gone, but I would never, ever go looking for him. Story 4. The Watcher in the Dark. I've worked the night shift at Morgan's convenience store for almost a year now. It's not a great job, but it pays the bills. The worst part isn't the drunks, the occasional shoplifters, or even the boredom. It's the silence. Between customers, the store feels like a ghost town. The hum of the refrigerators and the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights are the only sounds keeping me company most nights. It was a cold November night, and I had just finished sweeping near the front counter when I saw him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. He stood at the far end of the parking lot, just beyond the reach of the store's dim overhead lights. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching. I glanced at the clock. 2:30 a.m. Not unusual for late-night stragglers, but something about him made my skin crawl. He didn't have a phone out, wasn't smoking, wasn't looking around like he was waiting for a ride. He just stood there. I told myself he was probably waiting for someone, maybe hesitating to come in because he was short on cash. People get embarrassed about that. Still, I kept my eye on him as I counted the till. He never moved. The first night I saw him, I told myself it was a one-time thing. Just some guy waiting for a ride or killing time before heading home. But then it happened again. The next night, at exactly 2:30 a.m., he was there. Same spot, same stance, just standing at the far edge of the parking lot, watching. And the night after that, by the end of the week, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. He never came inside, never spoke to anyone, never moved closer. Just stood there, a shadowy figure in the distance, barely visible under the flickering streetlight. At first, I tried to ignore him. I told myself I was being paranoid. But every night, when the clock hit 2:30, I would glance toward the lot, and there he was. I don't know what finally pushed me to confront him. Maybe it was the unease that had been building inside me, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared. One night, I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin as I crossed the empty lot. My breath came out in white puffs as I forced myself to walk toward him. "Hey," I called out, keeping my voice firm. "Do you need something?" The man didn't answer. He didn't even flinch. I took another step closer. "Sir." Slowly, he turned. Without a word, he walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the streetlight. I stood there, heart pounding, watching him go. He hadn't run. He hadn't hurried. Just walked away like nothing had happened. I told myself that was the end of it. I was wrong. Escalation. A few nights later, my shift ended at 3 a.m., and I was more than ready to go home. I locked up the store, tossing my bag into the passenger seat of my car before sliding behind the wheel. Then, as I glanced in the rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. He was there. Not in the parking lot this time. Not in his usual spot. He was across the street, standing on the sidewalk, staring directly at my car. My hands shook as I fumbled to start the engine. I wasn't going straight home. I wasn't about to let this guy follow me there. I pulled out of the lot and turned left, heading away from my apartment. After a few blocks, I took another random turn. Then another. I zigzagged through town, taking unnecessary streets, driving in circles to make sure I wasn't being followed. Finally, I exhaled, feeling my shoulders relax. Maybe he hadn't followed me after all. Maybe I had just imagined. I checked the mirror. He was still there. My stomach dropped. Same distance. Same posture. Moving just enough to keep up, but never rushing. Like he knew exactly where I was going. By the second week, I was done pretending this was nothing. I went to the police. I sat in a small, cold room at the station, explaining everything to a tired-looking officer who scribbled half-hearted notes as I spoke. "He just stands there," I said, "every night at the same time. He followed me home once. I mean, not all the way, but he was there, watching." The officer sighed. "Has he threatened you?" "No, but..." "Has he trespassed on your property?" I hesitated. "No." "Has he tried to harm you in any way?" "No." The officer set his pen down. "Look, I get that this is creepy, but technically, he hasn't broken any laws. If he comes onto your property or makes a direct threat, call us. But for now, there's not much we can do." I left the station feeling even worse than when I'd arrived. A week passed. The man kept showing up. And then, one night, something changed. I was taking out the trash after my shift when I noticed a piece of paper taped to the back door. My stomach knotted as I stepped closer, heart pounding as I reached for it with trembling fingers. For words, written in shaky, uneven handwriting. "I like watching you." I dropped the note like it was burning my skin. My breath came in short gasps as I ran back inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I begged my manager to check the security cameras. The footage made my stomach turn. He had been there for hours. The cameras showed him arriving just after midnight. He stood by the back door, unmoving. At one point, he pressed his hand against the glass, tilting his head as if listening. Then, just before my shift ended, he taped the note to the door and walked away. I called the police again. They sent an officer to take another report, but the response was the same. Until he did something more, they couldn't help me. I wasn't waiting for something more. I bought a security camera for my apartment that same day. By the end of the week, I was exhausted. I barely slept, constantly on edge, jumping at every noise. Then, one evening, I came home and felt it before I saw it. Something was wrong. My apartment door was slightly open. I froze in the hallway, my breath caught in my throat. I knew I had locked it that morning. I knew. Slowly, I pushed it open. The lights were still off, the air inside heavy with silence. Nothing looked out of place. My TV was there, my laptop still on the desk. But as I stepped inside, a shiver crawled down my spine. Something felt touched. I checked my bedroom. My drawers were slightly open. My laundry shifted like someone had run their hands through it. I backed out of the room, my heart racing. I didn't need to check the rest of the apartment. I already knew. Someone had been inside, and they hadn't taken anything. I called the police again. This time, they sent someone right away, but there were no signs of forced entry. No fingerprints. No proof. Just my word. I installed extra locks and a security system that night. But the feeling never went away. I wasn't just being watched anymore. I was being hunted. I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I put in my notice at the store, packed up my apartment, and booked a one-way ticket out of town. I didn't care where I went as long as it was far from here. Far from him. All I had to do was get through one last shift. That night, the air inside the store felt heavier, like it knew something was coming. The clock above the register ticked forward, minute by minute, bringing me closer to the inevitable. 2:29 a.m. I gripped the counter, staring out at the parking lot, waiting. 2:30 a.m. Like clockwork, the man appeared. But this time, he didn't stay in the shadows. For the first time since this nightmare began, he walked straight toward the store. My breath caught in my throat as the automatic doors slid open with a soft chime. He stepped inside. Up close, he looked almost ordinary. Medium build, graying hair, sunken eyes. But there was something deeply wrong about his expression. His lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes, like he knew a secret I would never understand. He didn't speak, didn't browse the aisles. He just walked up to the counter and stood there, staring at me. I could feel my pulse in my throat. "Do you need something?" I forced the words out, my voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat. My stomach clenched. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to move, to grab the emergency bat under the counter, to run. I lunged for it, gripping the handle, bracing for whatever he was about to pull out. But it wasn't a weapon. It was a Polaroid picture. Slowly, he slid it across the counter toward me. Confused, I looked down, and the world seemed to tilt beneath me. It was a photo of me, sleeping. My bed, my room, taken from inside my apartment. The bat slipped from my fingers, clattering against the tile floor. I looked up at him, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He leaned in, close enough that I could smell his stale breath. "I'll find you again," he whispered. Then, as calmly as he had entered, he turned and walked toward the exit. The doors slid open, and then he was gone. I don't remember calling the police. I don't remember the officers questioning me, their voices blending into a distant hum. All I remember is that picture, that awful, impossible picture. When the police checked the security footage, I was certain they'd finally have proof. This time, he had come inside. This time, there was no way they could say it was just my imagination. The officers and I gathered around the tiny screen in the back office as the manager played back the footage. There I was, standing behind the counter. The automatic doors slid open. Then, nothing. No man. No one stepped inside. But there I was, staring at something, my body stiff with fear. I reached for the bat. I flinched. I reacted to someone who, according to the footage, wasn't there. The video showed me dropping the bat, looking down at the counter in horror. My lips moved, but no sound came out. Then the doors slid open again, and just like that, he was gone. Except he had never been there. One of the officers cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Might be a glitch," he muttered, but I saw the way his hands tightened at his sides. A glitch. Sure. I left town the next day. I didn't care about breaking my lease or leaving behind my things. I packed what I could fit in my car and drove across state lines, settling in a small apartment in a city where no one knew me. For a while, I almost believed it was over. Months passed. The nightmares faded. I started sleeping through the night again. Then, one afternoon, I came home to find a package waiting for me. No return address, no markings, just a plain envelope, sealed tight. A familiar dread crawled up my spine as I carried it inside. My hands shook as I opened it, my breath catching in my throat as I pulled out what was inside. A Polaroid. Another photo of me, sleeping. But this time, it wasn't from my old apartment. It was from here. My new home, my new bed, my new life. With trembling fingers, I turned the photo over. 4 words were scrawled across the back in that same, uneven handwriting. "I told you I'd find you." Story 5. The Man Under the Bed. I still remember the first night I spent in that apartment. It was a small studio in Texas, the kind you take when you're a broke college student just trying to get by. The rent was cheap, almost too cheap for the area, but I didn't question it. I needed a place fast, and this one seemed fine. The apartment itself was simple. A twin bed pushed up against the wall, a desk near the only window, a tiny kitchen area, and a closet that barely fit my clothes. The landlord had mentioned the place came partially furnished, but that only meant there was an old mattress on the bed frame. I didn't mind. What had bothered me, though, was the space beneath the bed. It was unusually large, too much clearance between the mattress and the floor. I could probably fit a few storage bins under there, maybe even a suitcase or two, but something about it unsettled me. I tried to shake it off. It was just a bed. That first night, I lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with all the little anxieties of living alone for the first time. The hum of the old refrigerator, the occasional creak from the walls settling, it all blended together into a quiet, unfamiliar soundscape. At some point, I drifted off. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't a noise that startled me. It was a feeling, that thick, suffocating sense that someone was watching me. My skin prickled as I lay frozen, my breath shallow. I scanned the dark room, my eyes adjusting to the faint light from the street lamp outside. The closet door was shut. The desk was empty. The only place someone could be hiding was. I swallowed hard. It was just my imagination, I told myself. First night jitters. I was in a new place, alone, and my mind was playing tricks on me. After a long minute, I forced myself to roll over, facing the wall instead. I closed my eyes and waited for sleep to take me again. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. The strange feeling never really went away. During the day, everything seemed normal. I went to class, studied at the library, and came home like any other college student. But at night, when I was alone in that little apartment, something always felt off. At first, it was little things. I would set my keys on the kitchen counter before leaving for class, only to find them on the table when I got back. A water bottle I was sure I had left on my desk would somehow end up on the floor. I figured I was just being careless. Maybe I was distracted, or maybe I was more tired than I realized. Then came the sounds. The apartment was old, so creaks and groans weren't unexpected. But some nights, long after I had turned off the lights, I would hear something different, a faint, deliberate shift in the darkness. Not the random settling of an old building, but something slower, more purposeful, as if someone was adjusting their weight, as if someone was trying not to be heard. I told myself it was my neighbors. Thin walls, bad insulation, it had to be that. But then there was the smell. No matter how often I cleaned, a faint odor lingered in the air. Something musky, like sweat and damp fabric. It would come and go, never strong enough to pinpoint, but enough to make me uneasy. One night, I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when it slipped from my fingers and tumbled onto the floor. With a sigh, I reached down, patting around in the dark. My hand brushed against something soft. For a second, I thought it was just an old sock or a stray piece of clothing I had forgotten about. But as I pulled it into the light, my stomach twisted. It was a shirt, not mine. The fabric was rough, worn down by time and grime. The color was faded, and there were dark stains near the collar. A rip down the side exposed yellowed stuffing, as if someone had used it as a makeshift pillow. I dropped it instantly. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it had been left behind by the last tenant? Maybe it had fallen from the closet somehow? I didn't want to think about any other possibility. The next day, I met up with Rachel, my best friend since high school. We grabbed coffee, and somewhere between talking about classes and complaining about professors, I mentioned the weird things happening in my apartment. She raised an eyebrow. "Are you serious? You think you have a ghost?" I rolled my eyes. "I didn't say that. It's just weird. Stuff moves. The place smells sometimes. And last night, I found this disgusting old shirt under my bed." Rachel leaned in, grinning. "Okay, that's creepy. You checked under the bed, right?" I hesitated. "Not really." Her grin faded. "Dude, why not?" I laughed it off, but the truth was, I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see whatever else might be down there. Rachel, being Rachel, wasn't satisfied with that answer. "We're checking when we get to your place. No arguments." I groaned. "Fine." I told myself it was just a joke, just Rachel being dramatic. But a part of me didn't want to go back at all. The noises got worse. At first, it was just the occasional creak or shuffle, things I could brush off as an old building settling. But then, every night, exactly at 3 a.m., I started hearing something else. Faint breathing. Soft, rhythmic, almost in sync with my own. At first, I thought it was coming from the apartment next door, maybe a neighbor snoring. But it wasn't that. One night, as I lay there, holding my breath to listen, the sound continued. Steady, deliberate. I wasn't imagining it. And then came the tapping. It was barely audible, like the light drumming of fingers against a hard surface. But I could feel it more than hear it. A soft vibration from the floorboards beneath my bed. Tap, tap, tap. My body stiffened. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might shake the bed. I squeezed my eyes shut. I did not want to look. But something inside me, some desperate need to prove to myself that I was being ridiculous, forced me to move. I took a deep breath, gripped my phone like a weapon, and leaned over the edge of the bed. Darkness. The space under the bed was pitch black, my eyes unable to adjust. I reached out and swiped my phone's flashlight on. But before I could angle it downward, nothing. I let out a shaky breath. Maybe I had imagined the tapping. Maybe it had been from the pipes or the wind outside. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, watching, waiting. The next day, I had an idea. If I was just being paranoid, I needed to prove it to myself. So, before bed, I set up my phone on my desk, propped against a book, camera facing my bed. I hit record, climbed under the covers, and did my best to ignore the sick feeling in my stomach. I forced myself to sleep. In the morning, I hesitated before grabbing my phone. A part of me didn't want to watch the footage, but I had to. I pressed play. For the first few hours, nothing happened. Just me, shifting in my sleep, the dim glow of streetlights filtering through the window. Then, at 2:58 a.m., something changed. The bed skirt moved, just slightly, like a breeze had passed through the room. Then, slowly, a pair of pale hands slid out from under the bed. My breath caught in my throat. My fingers clenched around my phone. The hands were thin, almost skeletal. They gripped the floor, pulling something forward. And then, a figure crawled out. It moved unnaturally, shifting its weight in a jerky, insect-like motion. As it unfolded itself to stand, I saw its face. Or rather, the lack of one. The camera's night vision blurred the details, but I could see its head tilting, as if it was listening, watching. It stood beside my bed, watching me sleep. For almost an hour, it didn't move. Then, just before it slithered back beneath the bed, it leaned down. Its mouth moved, whispering something into my ear. The audio was too muffled to make out the words, but in the footage, I stirred, as if I had heard it in my dreams. I dropped the phone, my entire body frozen in terror. I had been sleeping inches above it this entire time, and it knew. I didn't sleep after watching the footage. I sat on my bed, shaking, my mind racing. That thing, no, that person, had been under my bed for God knows how long, watching me, moving around while I slept. I couldn't stay here. I wouldn't. By morning, I had already booked a hotel. I wasn't even going to wait for my lease to end. I'd figure that part out later. I packed in a frenzy, stuffing clothes into my suitcase, throwing my books into a backpack. Every noise made my skin crawl. Every shadow felt like it was watching me back. But before I left, there was one thing I had to check. I had to be sure. I dropped to my knees and lifted the bed skirt. The space was empty. No strange hands. No pale, faceless figure. Just dust and a few stray hairs. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Had I imagined all of it? Was it a trick of the light? A nightmare mixed with sleep paralysis? I wanted to believe that. A nervous laugh escaped me as I rubbed my face. Jesus, Sam, you're losing it. Shaking my head, I reached for my suitcase. That's when I saw it. Something scratched into the wooden floor beneath the bed. At first, I thought it was just scuff marks from the bed frame, but when I leaned closer, my breath caught in my throat. The words were carved, deep and deliberate. I saw you looking. My stomach twisted. The letters weren't old. The edges of the cuts were fresh. Tiny curls of wood still clung to the grooves. Whoever, whatever, had been under my bed last night had written this, and they knew. I scrambled backward, my pulse hammering in my ears. My skin prickled as I noticed something else. The wood around the words. It was scratched. Not like a knife had been used, no. Like fingernails had dug into it. That was when I heard it. A slow, drawn-out creak from across the room. The closet door. It wasn't closed anymore. My breath hitched as I turned my head. A man stood there, grinning at me. His skin was stretched tight over his face, pale and sunken. Long, matted hair clung to his forehead. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, hungry. His clothes hung in tatters, the fabric stiff with filth. He reeked, the same musky, damp stench I had noticed for weeks. We stared at each other for a second that stretched into eternity. Then, he lunged. I screamed and scrambled to my feet, but he was fast. Too fast. His fingers closed around my ankle, yanking me backward. I hit the floor hard, my chin slamming against the wood. Pain exploded through my jaw, but I barely felt it. I kicked. Hard. My foot connected with his face, and he let out a sharp grunt, his grip loosening just enough. I didn't think. I ran. I threw myself at the door, wrenching it open so hard it nearly came off the hinges. I bolted into the hallway, my heart slamming against my ribs. Behind me, I heard movement, heavy footsteps pounding after me. I didn't look back. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the front lobby, until I was outside, gasping for air, hands shaking so violently I could barely dial 911. When the police arrived, they searched the apartment. He was gone, but inside the closet, they found something. A small, tattered blanket, empty food wrappers, a rusted kitchen knife, and in the farthest corner, behind my hanging clothes, a hole in the drywall, leading into the walls, leading into other apartments. I never went back. I never will. I spent the next few hours in a daze, wrapped in a blanket in the back of a police cruiser. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The officers came in and out of the building, speaking in low, serious tones. I caught bits and pieces of their conversations. Found an opening behind the closet. The walls lead to multiple units. God knows how long he's been in there. Collected her stuff. Hair ties, socks, even pictures. I felt sick. Inside my apartment, inside my walls, was a hidden crawl space. The police found an opening behind my closet that led into the dark, narrow passages between the units. The man, the thing that had been under my bed, had been living there for months, sneaking out at night, watching me. The officers found a pile of my missing things deep inside the crawl space. Hair ties, socks, Even a shirt I didn't remember losing. And worst of all, photos. Dozens of them, all taken while I was asleep. Some were close-ups of my face, my hands, my hair spread across the pillow. I gagged when I saw them. How many nights had he stood over me? How many times had he reached out, inches from my skin, before deciding to crawl back under the bed? I would never know. Eventually, the police identified him. His name was Daniel Carter, a former tenant. He had been evicted months ago, but he never actually left. Instead, he hid. He had lived in the walls, moving through the tunnels that connected to other apartments. No one ever noticed, until me. "He's been watching you," one officer told me, waiting for the right moment. I didn't ask what that moment was supposed to be. I didn't want to know. I moved out immediately. I found a new place across town, one with no crawl spaces, no gaps under the bed, no hidden walls. The first few nights, I barely slept. Every noise made my heart race. Every shadow felt wrong. But eventually, the fear faded. Slowly, I started to feel safe again, until the text came. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when the notification popped up. Unknown number. I frowned and clicked it open. Only 4 words. "I miss watching you sleep." I dropped my phone. My mouth went dry. My hands turned to ice. Because in my new apartment, when I had just finished unpacking, there was no way anyone should have known my number, and no way anyone should have known where I slept.